So in America's context, a constitution, if we go a little bit more general, a constitution is the solid rock foundation upon which legislative law happens. Is that an accurate understanding?
That's correct. It's your base law. It's your primary law. And all laws have to agree with that.
And so if we want to change the Constitution, what we're actually proposing is to change the foundation of a country, and it's not a trivial thing.
That's correct. We have proposals in this country for what we call a con-con. I forget how many states have issued a call for it. It has to be 2/3 of the state need to ratify a call for a constitutional convention, which either A, could be empowered or authorized to deal with only one issue, or B, and this is the area of debate, it could just become a freewheeling runaway in which they could just trash the whole current Constitution. And as I say, you look at the poor knowledge base of millennials today, say, for example. They are undereducated. They think themselves well-educated. They've been given a line of politically correct garbage, and that's all they know and understand. And if you took all of the wacky-dacky ideas about rights today that are running around and constantly changing, can you imagine trying to write all of that stuff into a constitution? The people today are not philosophically and politically well-grounded like the founders were in the spirit of the times, those ideas of both sides of the English Channel that you were talking about. So that's the difficulty. Now, you can amend a constitution. It's been done quite a few times. It can be done by a vote of the people. The states always have to refer to it. Congress can initiate it. There are several ways that it can be amended, but it ultimately has to be approved by 3/4 of the states before the amendment takes effect. The founders intended the Constitution to be difficult to change, so that it would not be subject to the buffeting that goes on from year to year and decade to decade in debates and things that people want. It was designed to be immune to that, but it's under pretty brutal attack right now.
I mean, that sounds perfectly reasonable and logical because, I mean, once you lay the foundation of a building, I mean, when an earthquake shakes it, the foundation, and it moves, everything that is built upon it is in jeopardy. And so the Constitution should be something that is written in such a way that it doesn't need changing. I mean, certain things may come up as time goes on, but ultimately you would try and write it in the way of intending it to be a long-term document.
That's right, but nobody can see the whole future except for God, okay? And the founders understood that we might have to make some changes. So, say, for example, we've made some good changes. We abolished slavery and established equal citizenship for everybody, regardless of race. So that was an important thing, 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. We tried prohibiting alcohol. We went through 10 years of that nonsense before they repealed that amendment. They put a curse upon the country when they enabled the income tax, which has been a curse ever since then, because there were much better ways to collect tax, and now Congress has the right to snoop on everything that we do. So, yeah, it can be done. And like we also limited by constitutional amendment the number of terms that someone could serve in the office of president. Before, it was unlimited. And the only president to hold 4 terms was Franklin Delano Roosevelt during World War II. Of course, he died in office just a short time after taking office in the 4th term. And at that point, they decided to limit it to 8 years, 2 terms.
Yeah, we have a limited duration before an election, but theoretically, if one party gets elected for the next 100 years, there's no limit to that, because ultimately the leader of the party in Australia is the Prime Minister, and you vote for the party, and the party then the promotes a leader, which is the Prime Minister of the country. In Australia, we have Indigenous people in Australia as part of our citizenry, as well as America does, and Canada does, and New Zealand does, and lots of countries do.
Yep.
They are proposing to put into our constitution something called a constitutional voice. And it seems like what is occurring is some people have called it apartheid, but I don't think that's an apt word. But it seems like what they're doing is creating a second parliament of Indigenous people who then speak to influence what goes on in policy. And they want to put that into the constitution. It seems like, they want to set up an Aboriginal parliament that will speak, that is constitutionally recognised. And for me, that's really scary, because it seems to me that what is actually occurring, that might be a precursor to splitting the country, basically.
What authority, whenever a politician says something, you've got to ask 4 questions, okay? What does that mean? That's the first question. So you already named it there. Number 2, how will that be implemented or enforced? Number 3, is it voluntary or mandatory? And be careful of voluntary, because things have a way of being voluntarily mandatory. And number 4, who's going to pay for it? And so I would agree with you, because, the argument is always, whether it's Canada, the U.S., Australia, that, these people were here first and you all guys came in and pushed them aside, yada, yada, blah, blah, blah. Well, let's go to Great Britain, okay? Who were there first? The Celts. What happened then? Well, then all of the Germanic-speaking people came in, the Anglo-Saxons, right? Whoop, they came in. They pushed the Celts out into Scotland, into Wales, and into Ireland. What happened after that? 1066, the Norman invasion. The French came over, and they forced their way in, and they took over the country. So, and that's where, by the way, that's where our English comes from, because our English, in about 200 years from from the invasion of Normandy, 1066, till about the time of Chaucer, 2 centuries later, became a mix of German, Celtic, French, and Latin. And that's why English is a crazy language today. Because you've got 4 different sets of rules. But now that that's done, and that is the history of the world, if you look all around the world, it's the story of one tribe pushing into another tribe's area. But here we are today. And so you have Australia, you have people coming from all over the place, you have native groups that are there in Australia, but it's still one person, one vote. It's all one country now. How we got here is not that important. And so the question is, are they going to be like a lobbying group would be here in the United States, where certain groups and interests have a right to lobby Congress people? Or are they going to have a separate vote or veto power in there? It gets a little spooky, because then the people who aren't in that group will become resentful at some point or another.
Yeah, splitting people in terms of Indigenous and non-Indigenous ignores the fact that, we're a young country by world standards, but still 200 years old. That's a lot of generations. Personally, my ancestor came over on the first fleet and has been part of building Australia since then. I mean, the first generation, the guy who came over was a bit of a ragamuffin, not someone I'm proud of. But after that, his son built communities and became an integral part of establishing a stable community in Tasmania. And, my mum's family name, who's from where that comes from, you can find it all over Tasmania, because these people established a home here. And so when we come to 2022 or 23, whenever they start to talk about this, to then go and split constitutionally the Indigenous from the so-called colonizers, or some people call them the invaders, you're really creating conflict.
You're correct. Now remember that is the goal of cultural Marxism.
Yeah.
Okay. The whole goal of cultural Marxism, which emanated from the mind of the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci, and which was spread throughout the Western world by people fleeing from Germany, members of what was called the Frankfurt School, which was originally called the Institute for Marxist Research. They changed their name when they arrived in other countries, but that's it. And the goal today is to divide, 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 even oftentimes in the name of unifying, to get groups mad at each other. This is called a dialectical process. So the groups are going back and forth, thinking that the problem is the other group, when in reality, they're being moved together to a third destination that most of the people don't suspect. And that's what's happening today. And so what you're doing is division. Over here, Black Lives Matter. Who is it founded by? Some avowed Marxists. What does it do? It divides. And so that's the problem that we have is, yeah, you're right. Some of your people came from one place. The natives came from another place. They didn't just start there. They had to come into that land at some point or another. But now what? Here we are, like you said, 200 years later. And in our case, it's almost 500 years later. We're all here. Same thing happened in Mexico. In Mexico, the Aztecs, called the Mexica, from which they get the word Mexico, had enslaved all of the native tribes around them. And they were using their men for human sacrifice to their gods, which is why when the Spaniards arrived with Cortez, the tribes were more than happy to ally with the Spaniards against Moctezuma and the Aztecs. And so even here in the United States, our own tribes in the southwest of the country had the Comanches and the Apaches, and they never got along with each other. In the northern part of the country, in my area here, we have the Lakota Sioux, and they were looked down upon by all the other tribes because they'd run around raiding the tribes, stealing the horses, kidnapping the women. Lewis and Clark expedition, the translator that went along, was a woman who had been kidnapped from her tribe, from the Shoshone tribe, and was eventually peddled off to a French trapper as her wife, and she became the translator for the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804 to 1806, where they traveled all the way from the East Coast to the Pacific. So the idea that anybody has a sacred grab to the land, well, yeah, sort of. There were places, if you want to go biblically, that God assigned to these different groups when they spread out. But the whole history of the world is one group pushing in on another group and trying to take their territory. But then afterwards, just like has happened in Great Britain, they merged. Okay, you had Anglo-Saxons, Normans, and after a couple of hundred years, all the distinctions dropped out, and they were all just what? Englanders. And that's how it runs. So today, why would you want to do that? Why are we suddenly going back to say, well, this group has a right to operate separately from that group? That's just breeding disaster, because that's what got our colonies going and up in an uproar, was the fact that the Brits kept treating us separately, and kept looking down upon us and would not recognize, for a while there we had home councils and able to do that. But I don't know. Remember that the goal of cultural Marxism, which has been chewing out the guts of Western civilization in our colleges and our schools for half a century, the goal is division and collapsing Western civilization. They hate it.